Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Imagine standing in front of an arena filled with, like, thousands of vulnerable people, and you're threatening them with eternal damnation if they don't open their wallets.
Right.
All while knowing you are about to board a private jet purchased with their life savings. Today, we are tracing the historical and modern machinery of monetizing God.
Yeah, it's a massive topic.
It is. And it raises this terrifying, mind-bending question about the psychology of belief,
Yeah.
Like, are the architects of these massive religious empires actually the most hardcore functional atheists on the planet?
Oh, absolutely.
Because to extort the vulnerable in the name of a divine judge, I mean, that requires a staggering, absolute lack of fear that said judge actually exists.
It really is the ultimate paradox of religious history. Like, the individuals shouting the absolute loudest about cosmic consequences, well, they frequently operate with the ruthless earthly efficiency of pure materialists. They package salvation, they scale it for maximum profit, and they build these, massive corporate empires, all while basically wearing the costume of the divine.
Right, exactly. And our guide for mapping out this paradox today is a highly satirical, deeply critical YouTube video from the channel called The Poopy Show.
Great name.
Right? And it's titled, How to Monetize Christianity, Easy Money. The creator uses internet culture to analyze centuries of religious extortion. And, since we are examining the mechanics of internet monetization today, I have to take a page out of the playbook and say, if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button.
Nice. Seamless.
Thank you, I try. But seriously, our mission for this deep dive is to analyze the timeline presented in the source material, moving from, medieval real estate empires all the way to modern megachurches.
Yeah, to figure out how human desperation basically became the most lucrative commodity in history.
Exactly. So, to understand this completely bizarre landscape of modern religious grifts, the source anchors its analysis in the original mega-wealthy entity.
Right, the medieval Catholic Church. We're talking roughly between the 12th and 16th centuries here.
Right.
And the foundation of this entire financial ecosystem, it was built on a brilliant theological invention called Purgatory.
Okay, let's spend a minute on the mechanics of purgatory, because the source points out a pretty glaring irony here.
Yeah.
Like, the Christian text explicitly warns that the love of money is the root of all evil.
Right.
Yet the medieval church managed to construct a system where money was the literal currency of spiritual absolution. I mean, purgatory wasn't hell, but it was essentially this agonizing waiting room, right? Where souls were punished for their earthly sins before they could, finally enter heaven.
Yeah, it's a waiting room with a toll booth.
Exactly. And that theological concept created an unparalleled market demand.
Well, yeah, and demand requires a product, right? So the church introduced indulgences. The going rate, as the video notes, was about 1/4 of a florin.
Which is...
Yeah, in exchange for that fee, you received a piece of paper that functioned as a divine pardon. Originally, these were used as, like, a recruitment tool for the Crusades. If you risked your life, you received full remission of penance. Plus, as the source Riley observes, you got a cool vest.
A cool vest. I love that deal.
Right. But the bureaucracy soon realized the massive, scalable potential of just selling that remission directly.
The closest modern equivalent that comes to mind for me is the corporate use of carbon offsets.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. A massive corporation pollutes the environment, but instead of actually changing their destructive behavior, they just, pay a fee to a regulatory body.
Right. They buy a carbon credit.
Exactly. They buy a credit to wipe the ledger clean.
Yeah.
Medieval indulgences were just carbon offsets for sin. You didn't have to fundamentally alter your moral compass. You just had to ensure your spiritual accounting was balanced by, paying the governing authority.
And just like modern corporate structures, they introduced tiered pricing for the ultra-wealthy.
Oh, of course they did.
Yeah, a one-time indulgence might clear a minor infraction, but wealthy nobility, they needed comprehensive coverage.
Right, they had a lot of sins.
Exactly. This led to what the source describes as a premium purgatory insurance model. A wealthy lord could literally pay a local monastery to have monks pray for his soul on a continuous daily basis.
That is insane.
It functioned exactly like an automated subscription service, ensuring a steady stream of revenue for the church in exchange for, ongoing spiritual firewall protection.
A spiritual firewall.
Yeah.
And the financial accumulation from these subscription services, it completely transformed the landscape of Europe.
Oh, yeah.
By the 15th century, the source notes that the church owned 1/3 of all land on the continent. 1/3.
It's staggering.
People were so terrified of the spiritual consequences awaiting them that they deeded vast estates and farms over to the church. The institution transitioned from a spiritual guide into a literal feudal landlord, subletting those exact same properties back to the populace.
Yeah, and the video creator makes a brilliant, absurd point here.
Yeah.
He questions how an institution can be your earthly landlord when a modern 14-page rental agreement contains absolutely zero concepts found in the Bible.
That's such a good point. Like, where is the theological backing for a security deposit?
Exactly. But, the consolidation of that much physical land and wealth, it inevitably leads to a desire for total market dominance.
Right.
When you own 1/3 of the continent, you are no longer just a church. You are an empire.
And empires protect their monopolies.
Exactly. This meant expanding the product line. They began heavily marketing physical merchandise, texts, icons, and just bizarre relics.
Oh, the relics.
The source highlights the absurdity of peasants spending their meager savings to touch something like a mummified finger, believing it offered a tangible connection to the divine.
But wait, I have to pause here. Because selling a mummified finger to a gullible peasant, I mean, it sounds terrible, but it also just sounds like standard medieval commerce,
Right.
Everyone was selling something weird in the town square. Was this practice what the source refers to as simony, right?
Yeah.
The selling of church offices and relics. Was it really a massive, coordinated extortion scheme, or just the natural result of a pre-industrial networking culture where you simply, bought your way into high society?
That's a fair question, but the sheer violence utilized to protect the practice proves it was functioning much more like an organized cartel than a simple networking club.
Really? A cartel?
Yeah, the source provides a chilling historical anchor for this. In 1494, a member of the Carmelite order named Adam of Genoa began publicly preaching against simony, threatening the legitimacy of this revenue stream.
Okay.
The response wasn't a theological debate. Adam of Genoa was murdered in his bed with 20 stab wounds.
Wait. 20 stab wounds, that's a mob hit.
Exactly.
That is a violent syndicate sending a very clear message to anyone considering disrupting the cash flow. I mean, it completely strips away the veneer of holiness and reveals a raw physical enforcement of a financial monopoly.
Precisely. But, violent suppression can only delay systemic collapse, not prevent it. The eventual breaking point came courtesy of Martin Luther.
Yeah.
The video actually frames Luther's famous 95 Theses in a way that perfectly translates to modern internet dynamics.
I loved this part.
Luther, a professor of moral theology, wrote a critique that was essentially meant for academic debate.
Right, and the analogy the video uses here is fantastic. It compares Luther's theological critique to a streamer accidentally leaking a 5-hour members-only video to the general public.
Yeah, exactly.
And the algorithm that made this leak go viral everywhere was the recently invented printing press.
Which changed everything.
Suddenly, the inner workings and the financial hypocrisy of the church were mass distributed. The public realized that the Pope, whose personal wealth literally dwarfed the richest kings, was taxing the poor to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica.
The printing press decentralized information, breaking the church's narrative monopoly. But it also provided an opportunity for cynical political actors to seize assets.
Enter Henry VIII.
Exactly. King Henry VIII is a prime example outlined in the source. He wasn't motivated by deep theological alignment with Luther. He just wanted a divorce and more power.
Right.
So he weaponized the trending public outrage to sever ties with the Pope, declaring himself the head of a new church and absorbing a massive amount of formerly Catholic real estate into the English crown.
Wow.
The theological debate was essentially hijacked for a hostile corporate takeover.
The players changed, but the realization that religion could be leveraged for massive geopolitical and financial power that remained totally intact.
Oh, for sure.
And as we jump ahead to the 20th century, we see how technological advancements simply provided new platforms for the exact same hustle. The printing press shattered the medieval monopoly, but the invention of television and the internet birthed a completely unregulated frontier.
Yeah, the video transitions into the era of televangelism, pointing out the absurd modern manifestations of this. Everything from older generations sharing bizarre AI Jesus images on Facebook to mass-produced Alibaba fidget crosses.
What's that to crosses?
Yeah. But beneath the cheap digital merchandise is a highly sophisticated, incredibly lucrative psychological engine known as prosperity theology.
Okay, let's dig into prosperity theology because this is where The thematic focus of our discussion, the tension between genuine belief and functional atheism, really takes center stage.
Right.
Prosperity theology is the doctrine that physical health and massive financial wealth are the guaranteed will of God for your life. But the catch is, the only way to unlock those divine blessings is to first give your money to the preacher.
Naturally.
It takes the old medieval idea of paying to avoid suffering and flips it into a Wall Street investment strategy. You seed the ministry with $100, and God is supposedly obligated to return 1,000.
It entirely removes the spiritual, transcendent nature of belief.
Yeah.
Prosperity theology turns the concept of God into a transactional vending machine.
The vending machine,
Yeah.
yes.
You input currency, you extract earthly rewards. It is a theology that operates with an overwhelming sense of atheistic materialism. The primary focus is no longer on the condition of your soul or preparing for the afterlife or ethical living.
No, not at all.
The focus is exclusively on accumulating capital in the here and now. The preacher serves as the broker for a cosmic wealth transfer system.
Calling it a transactional vending machine perfectly captures the psychology. And to keep people feeding money into that machine, these modern televangelists utilize a highly cynical, multi-step playbook, which the source video breaks down in brutal detail.
He really does.
The foundation of this playbook always begins with fear. You have to convince the audience that they are under constant, imminent threat.
Right, and the source cites the historical example of Jerry Falwell to illustrate this mechanism. Following the tragedies of September 11th, Falwell utilized his platform to publicly blame the terrorist attacks on domestic groups, specifically pointing fingers at abortions, feminists, and the gay community. The psychological tactic is to manufacture a state of profound panic, framing the world as a terrifying place facing immediate divine wrath and positioning the ministry as the only safe harbor.
It's so manipulative. Once you've terrified your audience, the obvious next move is to present yourself as the miraculous cure. The video highlights how this transitions into the abuse of hope, specifically pointing to Benny Hinn.
Oh, yeah.
The source describes how his operation would bring severely disabled individuals onto massive stages, utilizing them as, and this is the video's harsh but accurate terminology, show monkeys for theatrical fake healing tricks.
That's awful.
You're taking individuals who are out of medical options, people in the depths of despair, and exploiting their bodies to create an illusion of divine power that drives donations.
And the scale of the donations driven by these illusions is staggering, which brings us to the most visually absurd aspect of the televangelist playbook.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
The absolute refusal to fly on commercial airlines.
With private jets?
The wealth generated from exploiting hope isn't quietly tucked away. It is aggressively flaunted.
This is where my mind just breaks. The source brings up Jesse Duplantis, a preacher who literally stood in front of a camera and asked his struggling congregation to fund a $54 million Falcon 7X private jet.
Unbelievable.
And his justification wasn't that he didn't have one. It was that his current fully funded private jet was simply getting old.
Because of course it was, you know, to insulate themselves from the cognitive dissonance of their immense wealth versus their followers' poverty, they have to dehumanize the general public.
Right.
The video includes the infamous justification from Kenneth Copeland. He aggressively defended his fleet of private aircraft by stating that flying on a commercial airline would mean getting into a long tube with a bunch of demons.
Demons. He called commercial passengers demons.
Yeah. They psychologically separate themselves from the very people funding their aerospace travel. And this is not an anomaly. The source notes there are at least 15 highly popular televangelists operating today who own private jets.
You really have to ask yourself, how do you sustain the psychological pressure required to make a working-class family pay for your $54 million jet?
Yeah.
You use extreme guilt and blatant extortion. The source highlights Oral Roberts, who executed one of the most audacious extortion plots ever recorded.
Oh, this one is wild.
He went on television and told his audience that God had spoken to him, and that if he did not raise $8 million by the end of the year, God was going to literally kill him.
It's basically taking a hostage. But the hostage is the preacher, and the hostage taker is allegedly the divine creator of the universe.
It's so twisted.
It forces the audience into a frantic, manufactured crisis. And Robert Tilton, he applied this pressure on an individual level.
Right.
The source notes that Tilton taught that poverty is the result of sin, weaponizing shame against anyone struggling financially. He demanded what he called vows of faith, which were mandatory $1,000 donations.
The cruelty of the Tilton example is breathtaking. People were sending in these $1,000 vows attached to desperate, handwritten letters asking for prayer for their dying children or their failing marriages.
Yeah.
And the source reveals that Tilton's organization was literally throwing the unread prayer letters into the dumpster while cashing the checks to fund his personal plastic surgery.
It's sickening. And that utter disregard for human suffering is perhaps most visible in the exploitation of the terminally ill. The video points to Peter Popoff, who built an empire selling miracle spring water and miracle manna through late-night television.
Just exploiting the most vulnerable.
He was specifically targeting desperate cancer patients who had been told by doctors they had no time left.
This brings me back to the core realization I had at the beginning of our deep dive.
Yeah.
When you look at the totality of these actions, extorting $8 million under the threat of divine murder, throwing away the desperate pleas of the poor to buy Botox, and selling tap water to dying cancer patients, you realize you are observing a functional atheist.
Right, because if they actually believed.
Exactly. If any of these individuals actually believe in the theology, they preach a theology of an omniscient, completely just God who fiercely defends the weak and promises eternal fire for the wicked, they would be paralyzed with terror.
Oh, absolutely.
They would not be able to sleep at night. You do not exploit a dying cancer patient if you harbor even a microscopic shred of belief that a cosmic judge is recording your actions. The sheer brazenness of the grift requires an absolute certainty that no one is watching from above.
Their daily operational behavior proves they view the concept of God merely as a highly effective marketing demographic, not a literal reality.
Yeah.
They are operating the levers of an earthly corporation. But that raises a massive logistical issue.
Which is?
How does an earthly corporation, generating hundreds of millions of dollars through these highly questionable methods, avoid the crushing weight of the IRS and the legal system?
The ultimate loophole. You can fly above the theological consequences by being an atheist, but you still have to deal with the federal government.
Exactly. And the source identifies the legal shield that makes the modern megachurch possible, drawing from the example of the Crouch family.
Right, the Crouch family.
They operated a massive $750 million Christian media empire. The shield consists of two simple words, repeated endlessly. Ministry expense.
Ministry expense. As long as you can legally categorize the mansion, the high-end tailored suits, the luxury cars, and the Falcon 7X private jet as a ministry expense, it vanishes from the tax ledger.
It's magic.
It is completely shielded from the financial obligations that apply to every other business in the country.
If we look closely at this modern ministry expense loophole, we realize we haven't actually moved forward in time at all.
No, we really haven't.
It is functionally identical to the strategy of the medieval Catholic Church. Just as the 15th century church acquired vast amounts of European land to operate as a tax-exempt feudal landlord, modern televangelists acquire massive media conglomerates and real estate portfolios under the exact same tax-exempt protection.
Wow.
The underlying human machinery of exploitation is a constant. We simply swapped out handwritten purgatory indulgences for internet promo codes and tax-free media empires.
You know, speaking of promo codes, the source video actually makes a brilliant, deeply cynical pivot right at the end that perfectly captures the difference between honest commerce and religious fraud.
I love this part.
After spending the entire video exposing this massive machinery of extortion, the creator abruptly pauses to pitch his own sponsor, Gamer Subs, a brand of sugar-free energy drinks.
Yeah.
He looks right at the camera and tells his viewers to use the promo code Poopy for 10% off, explicitly joking that they can use the savings to fund their pseudo-gambling money for video game loot boxes.
It's a hilarious moment of self-awareness. The creator acknowledges that he is also operating within the modern internet attention economy, trying to monetize his audience, but the critical difference is transparency.
Exactly. When you use promo code Poopy, you know exactly what the transaction is.
Yeah.
You are trading your money for a caffeinated beverage.
Right.
The creator isn't promising you eternal life, and he isn't threatening your soul if you choose to buy a different brand of energy drink. The transaction is fundamentally honest.
Which stands in stark contrast to the absolute opacity of the religious grifts we've analyzed.
Exactly. The source even juxtaposes this modern nightmare with the original biblical story of the wise men. They brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh, without demanding a monthly subscription fee or a $1,000 vow of faith.
It highlights how thoroughly the core concepts of faith have been reverse engineered over the centuries to serve the exact materialism they originally opposed.
So, mapping out this journey for you listening, we start in the 12th century, examining how the fear of a theological waiting room called Purgatory allowed a spiritual institution to become the wealthiest feudal landlord in Europe.
Right.
We saw how violent monopolies over relics and the sheer arrogance of power led to a massive systemic fracture, accelerated by the printing press. And we watched that identical human urge for power adapt to television and the internet.
Yeah, manifesting as prosperity theology.
A system that utilizes fear, manipulates hope, funds fleets of private jets, and shields its massive wealth behind the magic words ministry expense.
And throughout all of it, we keep colliding with that central paradox. The individuals extracting the most wealth from the concept of divine judgment appear to be the ones least concerned about actually facing it. The monetization of belief, taken to its logical extreme, is indistinguishable from applied atheism.
It really forces you to examine the psychology behind what is actually being sold when you turn on a screen.
Oh.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, looking ahead to the future.
Okay.
We've established that the historical arc of monetizing faith is incredibly agile. It always adapts seamlessly to the latest communication technology, whether that's the 16th century printing press, 20th century cable television, or 21st century social media algorithms.
Right.
So what exactly will the next evolution of this industry look like in an era dominated by artificial intelligence and virtual reality?
Oh, wow.
If a televangelist can extort millions through a television screen, what happens when tech companies start offering subscription-based, highly personalized AI deities?
That is terrifying.
Imagine an artificial intelligence that listens to your daily conversations, learns your deepest, most intimate fears, and then generates a flawless, hyper-realistic avatar to preach a customized sermon designed specifically to optimize your digital offerings. Will the future of the religious hustle be a completely automated algorithm, perfectly engineered to drain our bank accounts in the name of a machine-learned God?
When you look at the historical trajectory of innovation in this space, an automated, hyper-personalized AI grift isn't just a science fiction concept. It is the highly probable next chapter in the playbook.
Something to keep in mind the next time you see a sponsored preacher popping up in your feed. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you on the next one.